Just 1 second.
Yeah, no worries, no rush.
All right, so we are now live. So, welcome everybody to another session of Being Singular. We've been dormant for a little while, but now we are back. So my name is Gregory Moss. I'm here with Alessandro De Cesaris. We're hosting this seminar series on being singular, focusing on systematic and historical questions relating to singularity. And today it's my great honor to introduce Elena Tripaldi, one of my favorite Hegelians. And maybe I start out just by saying that she completed her PhD, I think, in 2020 under Luca Literati. And I first met Elena in Padua, I guess, right? It was in Padua, I think, when I met you, 2022, right? Is that the year or is it 2023?
I think it was 2023, but
23. It was 23, you're right. It was 2023 in Padua. And yeah, it was at a talk she organized for me there. And it was, a great occasion. And let me just mention a couple of her publications. So just this year, she published a paper in Hegel Bulletin, Priority or Reflection, Ontological Dependence in the Contemporary Monism Renaissance. I recommend the paper. I have, in fact, read it. I don't read everything, but I have, in fact, read this one. And she has a forthcoming book called Hegel's Metaphysics of Subjectivity, The Truth of Substance. And I think we're going to get a preview maybe of some of the ideas in that book here, right? Yeah, good. And
yes.
Who's the publisher of this book?
So it was supposed to come out for Lexington Books, which then in the meanwhile was bought by Bloomsbury. So it will appear for Bloomsbury. Yeah.
Okay, Bloomsbury, excellent. And so right now you're the STARS Research Fellow at the University of Padua, I believe. And then in the past, she's had many other postdocs, some prestigious ones, the Thyssen postdoc at the Freie Universität and the DAD as well at Freie Universität in Berlin. And today, the talk is The Truth of Substance, Singularity in Hegel's Critique of Traditional Metaphysics. So thanks so much, and please take it away.
Thank you, Gregory, for your very kind introduction, and thanks, Gregory and Alessandro, for the invitation. As I was saying, as soon as I logged in, I had great esteem for the initiative. I was thrilled when the first series came out and watching the videos on YouTube. So it was truly an honor to receive the invitation. And thanks to everyone who's following the talk, either on the live stream or in the Zoom call. I look forward to the discussion. And I just go straight to my talk. I have shared the screen, so this is maybe easier to follow. It will be about 50 minutes. Okay. So I start with introducing the topic a little bit. Today, I would like to talk about the role of singularity in Hegel's critique of traditional metaphysics. I am especially glad to have this occasion because it allows me to present some core insights of the book I have recently completed and that will appear for Bloomsbury in the summer or fall of 2026, as Gregory was mentioning. So I think a good place to start is to specify what I mean by singularity. We were just saying that it's a very singular word. I take the term to mean the existence of radical finitude and contingency. In other words, something that is singular or is a singularity is a being that cannot be repeated or reduced. It is something that is radically and fully the specific individual thing that it is. One of the main theses of my book is that singularity so conceived is for Hegel a constitutive and ineliminable component of reality. Moreover, and more closely related to the analysis I will present to you today, the vindication of singularity as fully ontologically consistent plays a crucial role in Hegel's overcoming of traditional metaphysics. Indeed, I believe the pivot of Hegel's criticism of traditional metaphysics is precisely the claim that it failed to account for the existence of singularity. This claim comes with an additional specification, and namely, the vindication of singularity as fully ontologically consistent in Hegel does not exclude the possibility to identify a first unitary principle in which singularity's existence is grounded. In other words, Hegel does not vindicate the existence of singularity by affirming it as a brute fact or as a given that cannot be further explained or accounted for. On the contrary, Hegel's vindication of singularity and the overcoming of traditional metaphysics that thereby ensues is rooted in an immanent critique of what traditional metaphysics called the objects of reason. This expression was used to represent totalities or unities grounding the multiplicity in which they articulate themselves. As I will show today, Hegel does not claim, like Kant did, that these objects cannot be known, nor does he consider their notion as self-refuting. Rather, he holds that the conception of these objects offered by traditional metaphysics was insufficient, precisely because it excluded the possibility for these objects to ground singularity. These claims build the fundamental thesis of my book, which is that Hegel's logic presents a novel metaphysics whose aim is not only to affirm that there is singularity in the world, but also to answer the question as to why there is such singularity by showing that the latter is indeed the realization of a unitary principle grounding existence. So before getting to the core of my talk, I would like to give you a very quick overview of the book's structure and argument so that you can have an idea of the direction in which I want to push the analysis I will present today. So the book is divided in a very Hegelian way. I've always struggled with this because it has not 3 but 4 chapters. So the first chapter offers a reconstruction of the recent debate on Hegel's metaphysics, which was started by Pippin's now not so recent book, Hegel's Idealism. My claim here is that the debate lacked an engagement and reconstruction of Hegel's own use of the term metaphysics. This lack produces a significant conceptual confusion in the debate because interpreters take Hegel's use of metaphysics for granted and then project on the term whatever they themselves mean by it. In the second chapter, I try to bridge this gap, offering an analysis of Hegel's use of the term metaphysics from his early system drafts to the mature system. This analysis helps to show that Hegel uses the term with a distinct polysemy. At times, the term identifies modern intellectualistic metaphysics, which he wanted to discard and overcome, whereas at times it identifies ancient metaphysics, whose faith in the identity of thought and being Hegel considered as a speculative insight in need of further elaboration. Most importantly, in yet other occurrences, the term is used to identify a kind of metaphysics that Hegel saw as not yet actualized in the history of Western philosophy and which he himself planned to realize with his own logic. As I already mentioned above, this latter kind of metaphysics was characterized for Hegel by an exaltation of singularity and finitude as essential aspects of reality, which, however, should not come at the expense of a rationalist inquiry into the fundamental grounds of existence. In the third chapter, I turn to the science of logic to work out what exactly Hegel's proposal for a novel metaphysics entails. Focusing especially on the doctrine of essence, I show that Hegel set out to overcome traditional metaphysics by identifying a unitary principle, which grounds the existence of singularity. I identify the embryonic structure for Hegel's conception of such a principle in Hegel's understanding of essence as reflection and as absolute negativity, and show how this structure is progressively enriched and complicated throughout the doctrine of essence until action-reaction or the reciprocity of action, which constitutes its complete unfolding. In the fourth chapter, I consider the passage to objective to subjective logic, showing how Hegel conceived of the concept as a fully metaphysical structure, capturing not simply human or discursive rationality as a self-determining structure, but rather describing the structure of reality as a process of self-realization in which the unity of being is realized in a multiplicity of individual and contingent entities. So what I will present today is the central part of chapter 2, and if time allows, also a small glimpse into chapter 3. So let's now get to the overview of what I do in chapter 2. So to highlight the strong connection between Hegel's project of a new metaphysics with the vindication of singularity as an essential component of reality, I always like to start from the first preface to the Science of Logic. In the preface, Hegel mocks metaphysics, pointing out its utterly outdated character and celebrating the fact that this discipline has finally been abandoned in the philosophical world of his time. I quote, "What was hitherto called metaphysics has been, so to speak, extirpated root and branch, and has vanished from the ranks of the sciences. Where are the voices still to be heard of the ontology of former times, of the rational psychology, the cosmology, or indeed even of the natural teleology of the past, or where are they allowed to be heard?" So metaphysics is presented in the preface as a, I quote, "colorless self-preoccupation of spirit," end of quote, fit for solitary, self-involved outcasts rejecting the outside world in contemplation of the eternal. According to Hegel, the ways of philosophical thought have finally undergone a complete transformation, which recognize metaphysics' obsoleteness and banned it from the ranks of the sciences. The transformation Hegel is referring to, and which he enthusiastically defines the higher standpoint in self-awareness that spirit has attained in this period of time, is the one introduced by the exoteric version of Kantian philosophy. Thanks to this complete transformation, the experience of the world radically changed, shifting from metaphysics' experience of the world as colorless to a perspective in which existence shone transformed into the bright world of flowers, this is of course a quote, of which, as is well known, none is black. However, while praising the shift brought about by the exoteric teaching of Kantian philosophy, Hegel also notes that his time offers, I quote, "the singular spectacle of a cultivated people without metaphysics, like a temple richly ornamented in other respects, but without a holy of holies," end of quote. Clashing with the enthusiasm for the eradication of metaphysics from the ranks of the sciences, this claim suggests that metaphysics represents the heart, the indispensable element of humanity's experience, just like the Holy of Holies is the essential component of any temple. Thus, its eradication acquires an unexpected gravity. I quote, "Just as remarkable as it is when a people loses its metaphysics, when the spirit engaged with its pure essence no longer has any real presence in its life." On the one hand, then, Hegel sees the abandonment of metaphysics as an immediately liberating event, which promoted a decidedly healthy focus on the heartly dimension of life and experience. On the other hand, however, the eradication of metaphysics seems to have left a void that needs to be filled. Without it, spirit seems destined to lose contact with its own essence. This consideration is paired with a call for a reform of logic in accordance with the complete transformation brought about by the exoteric teaching of Kantian philosophy. Since the principle contained in this exoteric teaching has affirmed itself as a cultural mainstream, it is now possible, according to Hegel, to carry out this principle in all its specific implications without fear that this articulation will deprive it of its revolutionary momentum. I quote, "The period of fermentation that goes with the beginning of every new creation seems to be past. The demand for the elaboration and cultivation of the material becomes at that point all the more pressing. There is a period in the formation of an epoch in which the foremost concern is the acquisition and reinforcement of the principle in its undeveloped intensity. But the higher demand is that such a principle should be made into science." So the logic must respond to this higher demand, providing an exposition of the principle of the complete transformation, defining the spirit of Hegel's times, such that this principle is made into a science. Thus, it is clear that the need to make the study of logic live up to the complete transformation intersects with the need for metaphysics that Hegel laments by comparing a people without metaphysics to a temple without a holy of holies. Indeed, fully expounding the principle of the complete transformation that characterized the spirit of the time, which is what Hegel says should be the task of the new logic, coincides with occupying oneself with the understanding of spirit's own essence, which was the task of metaphysics. So the logic's preface indicates that one of the merits of the complete transformation is the shifting of philosophical attention away from the colorless plane in which traditional metaphysics placed truth, and which was clearly opposed to the bright world of flowers of finite and earthly existence. Against old metaphysics, then, the complete transformation invites to focus on the present, the finite, and the earthly. Thus, the new metaphysics that should be carried out by way of the logic should entail a recognition of the concrete and the finite as worthy of philosophical consideration and as integral aspects of the realization of or expression of the infinite and the truth. So this incursion in the logic's preface has shown that Hegel's understanding of the relationship between logic and metaphysics is along the lines of a coincidence in which speculative logic takes on and fulfills the task that traditional metaphysics carried out in the past, and which it cannot carry out anymore in the changed times of modernity. But what exactly made metaphysics incapable of fulfilling these tasks? And how can an enhanced attention to the earthly, the finite, and the colorful character of concrete reality be included in the new metaphysics? To answer these questions, we can turn to Hegel's discussion of metaphysics as first position of thought. What I care for the most in this analysis is to show that Hegel's criticism does not entail a dismissal of traditional metaphysics inquiry into a unitary principle for existence. Contrary to Kant, Hegel does not have a problem with metaphysics being busy with supposedly impossible endeavors. Rather, Hegel has a problem with the fact that metaphysics approaches such endeavors with the wrong tools, and namely with an insufficient conception of thought and with a faulty procedure to determine truth. In Hegel's analysis, these methodological flaws determine a warped understanding of what traditional metaphysics calls the objects of reason, such that the latter becomes self-undermining and apparently impossible to be known. Most importantly, traditional metaphysics' warped understanding of the objects of reason entails the denial and suppression of singularity as something that is opposed and other to these objects. It is precisely this split between principle and singularity, or between infinite and finite, that produces the apparently self-refuting character of the objects of reason. Therefore, this split is precisely what needs to be bridged. This criticism lays the groundwork for the immanent critique of metaphysics that Hegel will carry out in the Doctrine of Essence, showing the need to conceive a principle that is both one, as self-referred and identical with itself, and many, as realized in a multiplicity. So, in paragraph 26, the first one of the first position of thought in the encyclopedia, Hegel tells us that metaphysics is an attitude that underlies all human activity and is also the beginning of all philosophy. This attitude is one of trust, or as Hegel says, faith in the fact that our thinking reveals that what objects really are. I quote, "The first position is the naive manner of proceeding which contains the belief that through thinking things over, nachdenken, the truth comes to be known and that what the objects truly are is brought before consciousness. All philosophy in its beginnings, all the sciences, even the daily doings and dealings of consciousness live in this belief." At the beginning of paragraph 27, Hegel writes, and I quote, "Because it has no consciousness of its opposition, it is possible for this kind of thinking, metaphysics, to be both genuine speculative philosophizing in terms of its content, as well as to dwell in finite thought determinations, that is, the as yet unresolved opposition." So here Hegel is telling us that, like every other position of thought with respect to objectivity, metaphysics is also an expression of finite thought. In particular, Hegel traces metaphysics back to Nachdenken, or reflective thinking. In the encyclopedia's introduction, Hegel presents Nachdenken as an in-between form of thinking, which operates the transition from lower, non-speculative and non-philosophical forms of thought to the horizon proper of philosophical inquiry. If we look at paragraph 5, Hegel writes, I quote, "At any rate, thinking things over has at least this effect, namely that of transforming the feelings, representations, etc. into thoughts." In the annotation to paragraph 3, Hegel characterized representations in this way, and the connection between the two will be clear in a second. I quote, "The determinacies of feeling, intuition, desire, volition, etc., insofar as we are conscious of them, are usually called representations. Representations may generally be regarded as metaphors of thought and concepts." Representations, therefore, are forms of thought that still have a sensory content taken from outside the thought itself, and for this reason, they are not suitable for philosophical or speculative thought. Nachdenken has to do with representations. Here's the connection. But in dealing with them, at the very least, it prepares the material for philosophy, transforming representations into concepts and, so to speak, purifying representations of their sensory elements. In doing so, reflection leaves us with only concepts to think about. Nachdenken, however, does not go further than this. It does not go on to think about the concepts it extracted from representations. Thus, Nachdenken brings us at the threshold or the beginning of speculative thought and produces a sense of disorientation, which is precisely this beginning. I quote, "We sometimes hear people say that they do not know what they are supposed to think in connection with the concept they have grasped. When it comes to concepts, nothing further needs to be thought than the very concept itself. What those people mean to express, however, is the yearning for some familiar current representation of things. When deprived of its manner of representing, consciousness feels as if it had lost the ground in which it is otherwise so firmly rooted and at home." So Nachdenken pulls the rug out from under the ordinary thought process. It reveals the inadequacy of representation and leaves it in an apparent void, a space where, in order to give meaning to the determinations of thought, one must think of nothing but those determinations, without being able to refer to material taken from the outside, so from sensation or intuition, to give them meaning. So from these brief excursus in the encyclopedia's introduction, we can suppose that traditional metaphysics, as a manifestation of Nachdenken, will also produce a sense of, I call it, speculative disorientation in trying to overcome the horizon of representation. And we will see more clearly later how this happens. In the meantime, these considerations help us better understand the distinction between the two types of metaphysics that we found in paragraph 26. While the first type of metaphysics, what Hegel calls the naive procedure, is completely unaware that it is using finite determinations of thought, unsuitable for manifesting what objects really are, the second openly clashes with this inadequacy, manifesting it in a way we might call performative. Furthermore, these initial considerations already confirm that the problem of metaphysics for Hegel is not its object or its cognitive ambitions, but rather its recourse to forms of thought that are inadequate for these very objects and ambitions. This means that the aspect of metaphysics that should not be criticized, but rather preserved, is its commitment to knowing that what objects really are. In the continuation of paragraphs 27 and in paragraph 30, Hegel gives us more information about the content of metaphysics. Metaphysics is not about describing ordinary objects, and rather it is about understanding the objects of reason. It is in the understanding of these objects of reason that metaphysics seeks that what objects in general really are. I quote from 27 and 30, "This metaphysics is the perspective of the understanding alone on the objects of reason. Its objects were totalities, to be sure, which in and of themselves belong to reason, to the thinking of the in itself concrete universal, soul, world, God. So the objects listed here pertain to the branch of metaphysics traditionally defined as metaphysica specialis. Therefore, if we want to take Hegel's indication seriously, that metaphysics is a problem of form and not of content, we must accept that metaphysics for Hegel includes an investigation into the unitary structure of reality as world and into the unitary foundation of existence as God. And this applies not only to the old metaphysics, but also to the new metaphysics which Hegel wants to achieve with the logic. Indeed, as we read on through the first position of thought, we notice that the investigation of the objects of reason, that is the line of questioning proper of Metaphysica Specialis, is what interests Hegel the most. This confirms that this is precisely what Hegel considers to be the main task of metaphysics, one that, with the correction of form, can and must also be realized in the new metaphysics he carries out in his logic. In fact, Hegel devotes only one paragraph, namely paragraph 33, to the other part of metaphysics, Metaphysica Generalis or ontology. All the other paragraphs in the section speak of metaphysics as knowledge of the absolute or of the objects of reason. Moreover, in paragraph 33, Hegel subordinates Metaphysica Generalis to Metaphysica Specialis. Indeed, speaking of the determinations of the ontology of the past, Hegel writes, and I quote, "Due to their multiplicity and finite validity, a principle was lacking for these determinations. For this reason, they had to be enumerated empirically and contingently. It can be a matter merely of the correctness of the analysis, agreeing with linguistic usage, and of empirical completeness, not of the truth and the necessity of such determinations in and of themselves." So here Hegel is saying that, considered from the point of view of finite thought used by old metaphysics, the determinations of ontology lack a principle. This means, first of all, that for Hegel, the determinations of ontology, or the determinations that pertain, so to speak, to the description of finite entities, need to be grounded in a principle. Something is needed that guarantees the necessity of the determinations of ontology, or of the entities that they describe. Something that tells us why these entities exist. In other words, there cannot be Metaphysica Generalis separate from Metaphysica Specialis. The two must be done together. The investigation of the objects of reason carried out by Metaphysica Specialis serves to ground the investigation of finite entities carried out by Metaphysica Generalis. Traditional metaphysics fails to conceive of this connection or to realize this connection, not only because it develops ontology in an empirical and contingent way, that is, by continuing to refer to a reality external to thought in order to decide which determinations to consider, but also because of the specific way in which it ends up conceiving the objects of reason as Metaphysica Specialis. As I said before, traditional metaphysics obtains a warped understanding of its objects, or the objects of reason, as a consequence of its reliance on an inadequate conception of thought and on an equally inadequate process of inquiry. Firstly, this happens because traditional metaphysics relies on finite thought determinations and more precisely on representations. As seen above, the latter are in relation to content external to thought, coming from sensation and intuition. Thus, representations are isolated determinations for which the relation to other thought determination is irrelevant in the determination of their meaning. This creates two distinct problems for metaphysics. On the one hand, relying on representation makes metaphysics incapable of finding determinations that can exhaust the infinite character of the objects of reason. I quote, "Predicates such as these represent in and of themselves a limited content and show themselves to be inadequate to the fullness of the representation of God, nature, spirit, and so forth, and are in no way exhaustive." So the only way that traditional metaphysics can overcome this dilemma is to proceed by accumulation and imagine that the determinations that can be attributed to objects of reason are infinite. However, this produces clearly a bad infinity, which only signals an inability to truly understand the objects of reason. There will always be another determination or another predicate to be added to the others in order to achieve infinity. Moreover, and most crucially, this heap of predicates will never constitute a totality because they continue to be defined not in relation to each other, because they are representations, but with reference to an individual content external to thought. The other problem arising from the fact that metaphysics relies on finite or representative determinations is even more serious, because it affects not the supposed determination or knowability of the objects of reason, but the conception of their very nature or structure. Hegel tells us two things about the representative consideration of the objects of reason. The first is found in paragraph 31, where Hegel says, with reference to the determinations of objects of reason used by metaphysics, that, I quote, the character of particular subjectivity is blended in with them, end of quote. This reference takes us back to paragraph 3, cited above, where Hegel reminded us that representations are nothing more than metaphors of thought and concepts, and do not constitute true knowledge of the objects represented. So what Hegel is telling us here is that metaphysics, to give itself an idea of the infinity of objects of reason, resorts to images, to sensory references, which do not belong to metaphysical reasoning. This is also important for understanding the alternative to this point of view developed by Hegel in the Logic. God, the world, and the soul are for Hegel like metaphors, figurations of something which should be described and understood otherwise, with no sensory support. The second consequence of metaphysics' representative understanding of the objects of reason is expressed in paragraph 30, where Hegel writes, metaphysics laid them down as ready-made, given subjects for the application of the determinations of the understanding to them. With the expression ready-made given subjects, Hegel is telling us that metaphysics presupposes the very objects it is supposed to comprehend, or describe or articulate. Relying on representations and metaphors, metaphysics assumes that objects of reason are also determined independently of their relation to other determinations, and that they are self-standing, so to say. Here, however, we encounter a further paradox, produced not only by the representative and finite character of the determinations of metaphysics, but also by what Hegel calls its procedure. This procedure, Hegel tells us in paragraph 28, is predication or finite judgment as the heuristic tool to determine truth. I quote, that metaphysics presupposed in general that knowledge of the absolute could take place by attributing predicates to it. The paradox is expressed in paragraph 31, where Hegel says, the representations of soul, world, God seem at first to offer thinking a firm hold. However, they first need to receive their firm determination through thinking. This is expressed by every sentence insofar as in it what the subject is, that is the initial representation, is supposed to be indicated first by the predicate. In the addition, Hegel adds, the form of the sentence, or more precisely of the judgment, is in any case unsuitable to express that which is concrete and speculative, and the true is concrete. So we need to be a little careful here, because it may seem that Hegel is criticizing the propositional form in general, or the fact that in the proposition the subject must be predicated or determined in something other than itself, namely here, the predicate. In fact, Hegel is criticizing here only a specific form of proposition, which in the phenomenology he associated with a term I forgot to translate, which is rationalizing thinking, so intellectualistic thinking. The problem with this proposition, we see in the phenomenology, is not that in the subject obtains its determination from the predicate. It's not that in it the subject obtains its determination from the predicate. It is rather the opposite, and namely that the subject and predicate are kept separate and considered as if their meaning were already defined before their connection and relation in the proposition. For metaphysics, on the one hand, there is the subject, ready-made and given, and on the other, there is the predicate, also somehow ready-made and given. So in this perspective, their relationship in the proposition adds nothing to their determination and meaning. This is meant to express the fact that the connection between subject and predicate is thought of as a third thing, which is useful for the philosopher who must measure the adequacy of the determination he uses as predicates. It is of no use to the subject and predicate, which were already fully determined, ready-made, even without it. Yet, in the case of the objects of reason, this belief that metaphysics has that they are ready-made given subjects, determined before and independently of their predication, dissolves into a paradox. Known through predication or finite judgment, these objects are reduced to nothingness, a simple abstraction which, rather than providing thought with a firm point of support, finds itself seeking determination in the predicate as its other. So at this juncture, one should recognize the disorientation which we saw is characteristic of Nachdenken, which brings thinking at the threshold of the speculative standpoint. In the paradoxical reversal from firm points of support to empty abstractions needing determination from their predicates, the representations metaphysics use to identify the objects of reason dissolve into nothingness. In this dissolution, only the concept that these representations metaphorically expressed is left to be thought. Thinking the latter would mean to go and see, or wait and see, if the latter determines itself by itself, or if it goes from subject to predicate all by itself. In this movement of self-determination, the concept would indeed realize itself into that firm foothold which, as ready-made given subject, it could not be. Indeed, it would be concrete, full of content, and its passing into the predicate to acquire determination would not appear as a self-refuting contradiction, but rather as its realization. This is clearly expressed in the addition to paragraph 28, where Hegel is referred to say, true knowledge of an object must be of the sort that the object determines itself out of itself and does not receive its predicates from outside. So, a manifestation of Nachdenken, metaphysics comes close to this true knowledge. The propositions it produces are, in fact, already speculative propositions, which seek to connect infinite objects of reason with finite predicates, revealing them as concrete. Metaphysics, however, does not realize this, or realizes it only partially, admitting the emptiness of its representations of objects of reason, declaring these representations impossible to determine with finite predicates, but remaining convinced that this is how it must be, because objects of reason, which are infinite, cannot have anything to do with the finite. Hegel expresses this very well in paragraph 36, where he is discussing rational theology. I quote, "In this kind of consideration, guided by the understanding, all depends primarily on which predicates are suitable or unsuitable with respect to how we represent God to ourselves. The opposition between reality and negation is taken to be absolute here. Hence, in the end, there is nothing left for the concept, as the understanding takes it, but the empty abstraction of the indeterminate essence, that is, the pure reality or positivity, the dead product of modern enlightenment." So, considered as ready-made subjects, already defined and independent of its predicates, of those finite determinations considered so inadequate to characterize it and yet which would instead make it concrete, God fades into something totally abstract. His infinity is characterized precisely as abstraction or as a simple lack of determination. In the addition, we find an interesting note precisely on this. If the concept of God is construed only in the sense of an abstract or supremely real being, God becomes for us thereby a mere beyond, and there can be no further question of knowledge of Him. This passage reiterates the failure of metaphysics, which, in seeking to understand the objects of reason through finite thought, ends up demonstrating the impossibility of doing so. However, what interests me now is this expression of a mere beyond, which resonates with Hegel's critique of metaphysics in the Logic's preface as contemplation of the eternal and as the pursuit of a beyond that forgets to appreciate the serene world of flowers of earthly life. So with this reference, or stressing this passage, I want to remind you that what is at stake in Hegel's critique of metaphysics is not just the formal problem of how to correctly connect thought determinations, but also something very, very concrete. If God, or the object of reason, call it what you will, is understood as a beyond or as a ready-made given subject, separate and opposed to its determinations, then this means that the concrete, finite world that we experience every day remains completely separate from it, excluded from its truth, and therefore without foundation, just as the determinations of ontology were in paragraph 33. So we already know that this is precisely what Hegel wants to avoid, but it remains to be understood how this can be avoided. So as I anticipated at the beginning of the talk, I believe Hegel's solution is found in the logic and more precisely in the doctrine of essence. So knowing I have put a lot on the table already, I will use the next 10 minutes to give you a glimpse into my interpretation of the doctrine of essence, trying to keep it as brief as possible. Of course, this will be the densest 10 minutes of the talk, which I saved at the end just to make sure I knock you out completely and you don't ask too many difficult questions at the end. Okay. Hegel's solution to the problems of Metaphysica Specialis is found in the doctrine of essence, because only at that stage, the question of the relationship between infinite objects and their finite determinations can be addressed. Indeed, the notion of object of reason, as we have now defined it, is a rather complex notion, which presupposes a series of things that cannot be given at the beginning of the logic. First of all, the notion of the object of reason presupposes the fact that there are determinations. Then it presupposes the fact that there is a totality that is the foundation of these determinations and is realized in them. So this is far too much to begin with. And in fact, the logic first demonstrates that there are determinations or that being is determined. Then, before assuming that determined being is the determination of something beyond it, it tries to see if it is self-standing. So perhaps there are only determined finite beings and there is nothing else that manifests through them. The verification of this hypothesis occupies the entire doctrine of being, which in fact seeks to see if it is possible to account for determinacy within the horizon of determinacy. In measure, however, this endeavor fails. Determined beings are shown to depend on one another in endless chains of reciprocal determination. Thus, the determinacy of being dissolves into the infinite referrals of mutual dependencies between one thing and the other. As Hegel says at the end of discussion on measure, I quote, "Being in general and the being or immediacy of different determinacies have thereby vanished." So measure, which concludes doctrine of being, shows that determinacy is not the most fundamental characteristic of being and that it is not self-standing. Consequently, something more fundamental, so to say, than determinacy needs to be found to account for it. And this something more fundamental is precisely essence. I quote, "The truth of being is essence. Being is the immediate. Since the goal of knowledge is the truth, what being is in and for itself, knowledge does not stop at the immediate and its determinations, but penetrates beyond it on the presupposition that behind this being there still is something other than being itself, and that this background constitutes the truth of being." In introducing the concept of essence, Hegel immediately warns us against the possible misunderstanding of this notion, which is reminiscent of traditional metaphysics' representation of its objects of reason. I quote, "Being thus comes to be determined as essence, as a being in which everything determined and finite is negated. So it is simple unity, void of determination, from which the determinate has been removed in an external manner. To this unity, the determinate was itself something external, and after this removal, it still remains opposite to it. So it is easy to recognize here the same criticism that Hegel already made of metaphysics in the first position of thought. As long as we do not think of the movement that unites the objects of reason to their predicates as a movement of self-determination, which the objects of reason do by themselves, they will remain abstract, and the determined will remain without a principle capable of grounding it. Thus, if essence wants to realize itself as the truth of being, it is necessary that it passes into being, this is Hegel's expression, determining itself in the determinations of being that have disappeared in it. I quote, "Essence, as the complete turning back of being into itself, is thus at first the indeterminate essence. The determinacies of being are sublated in it. It holds them in itself, but without their being posited in it. Absolute essence in this simple unity with itself has no existence, but it must pass over into existence." Hegel immediately warns us of a fundamental difficulty in realizing this passing into existence. I quote, "In essence, the determinateness does not exist. It is posited only by essence itself, not free, but only with reference to the unity of essence. Determinations are reflected, posited by essence itself, in which they remain as sublated." So Hegel is clarifying that the determinacy that constitutes the existence of essence must be recovered or posited by essence exactly as it appeared in the doctrine of being, well, not exactly, but nearly as exactly as it appeared in the doctrine of being, that is, as immediate, ungrounded, and apparently self-standing. With this addition, however, essence's task of passing into existence becomes almost paradoxical. On the one hand, essence must recover the determinations of being that have vanished in it, demonstrating that they are its own determinations. On the other hand, while demonstrating that they are its own determinations, essence must also posit them as immediate and independent from it. So, as I've already said, the solution to this paradox can only be found at the end of the doctrine of essence. However, the fundamental structure of Hegel's solution is already found, I believe, in the discussion of essence as reflection. Reflection recognizes essence for what it appeared to be in the immanent development of the logic. That is, it thinks of it simply as the negation through which the determinations of being have been removed. I quote, "As it has come to be here, however, essence is what it is, not through a negativity foreign to it, but through one which is its own, the infinite movement of being. It is itself this negativity, the self-sublation of otherness and of determinateness." Reflection reveals that precisely because it is nothing but this negation, essence is an activity, a movement of constantly becoming other than itself to realize its unity with itself. I quote, "Reflection is transition rather as the sublating of transition, for it is the immediate falling together of the negative with itself. And so this coinciding is, first, self-equality or immediacy, but second, this immediacy is the self-equality of the negative and hence self-negating equality. Its being is to be what it is not." At first, or on one side, reflection reiterates that essence is the negation of determination, by which essence reunites with itself. In this first consideration, determinations are not realized in the immediacy which characterize them in the doctrine of being, because they are characterized as posits of essence or as entirely dependent on essence. I quote, "It is a positing, essence as reflection, is a positing inasmuch as it is immediacy as a turning back. That is to say, there is not another beforehand, one either from which or to which it would turn back." This negative unity of essence with itself, however, is an illusion or just one side of the story. Precisely because it is negativity, essence cannot remain fixed in simple equality with itself. Indeed, reflection also shows that the same negation by which essence returns to itself, negating determination, is a negation that essence refers to itself. Being essence already a negation, this self-reference of negation produces a double negation, or the negation which made essence one and identical with itself. Therefore, the negation by which essence returns to itself negating determination immediately produces a self-repelling. In its referring to itself, essence breaks away from its self-identity and splits into what Hegel calls a presupposition. The presupposition is indeed produced and grounded by essence, because it results from essence's self-reference. However, presupposition is grounded by essence in such a way that the negation, which would make presupposition vanish into essence, revealing its dependence on it, is itself negated. For this reason, presupposition appears as immediate and as radically other from essence. I quote, "But reflection is the sublating of the negative of itself, coincidence with itself. It therefore sublates its positing, and inasmuch as it is in its positing the sublating of positing, it is presupposing. In presupposing, reflection determines the turning back into itself as the negative of itself, as that of which essence is the sublating." So you see, hopefully, I made it suggestive enough. You see how this structure prefigures the possibility for essences passing into existence. As reflection, essence can not only give itself determination, but it can do so preserving the latter's immediacy and apparent independence as presupposition. So to conclude, I hope this final section gave a glimpse into how essence as reflection can be seen as Hegel's solution to the problem of metaphysica specialis. First of all, essence as reflection offers an understanding of the objects of reason as movements of self-determination, realized in their other. This provides us with a conception of totality and infinity which does not dissolve into self-refutingness and abstraction as the objects of traditional metaphysics did. On the other hand, the structure of essence as reflection also provides us with an understanding of a unitary principle which can ground singularity, showing that in singularity, essence's unity is realized over and over, and that, therefore, singularity is a non-reducible and essential characteristic of reality. And with this, I thank you very much.
Thanks, thanks so much, Elena. There's the virtual clap there. Okay, so let me see. I'm gonna keep an eye on YouTube so we can open it up for questions. Let me see. Let me log in here. Whoop, thanks so much, Ellen. Sorry. So I am sitting here looking at this. So if anyone has any questions on the YouTube, you can post it on the chat. But maybe we can start with the in-house here. So anyone has any questions, please don't be shy and raise your virtual hand or write me a message in the chat and we can get the conversation started. Okay, Alex, please go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Beautiful. So many thanks, Elena. This was very, very exciting. And I mean, I have many questions. First of all, a thing that came to my mind, there was a passage where you were talking, and I remembered there is in the essay on skepticism, Hegel at a certain point uses the word hyperphysics in order to address that kind of representation of metaphysics as what has to do with the beyond, so to say. And maybe I was just thinking, this is not a question, this is just a start the dialogue. Maybe that could be interesting as to highlight this idea that metaphysics is not a theory of the beyond in that sense, and maybe via this opposition between metaphysics and the hyperphysics, it becomes very clear, so to say. But I had some other questions. I was very sorry. I took a caption of your presentation so that I remembered the exact quotes. At the beginning, you said something that is singular or is a singularity is a being that cannot be repeated or reduced. It is something that is radically and fully the specific individual thing that it is. And I since the years of discussion with Greg are behind this question, but the question is, isn't this a
Don't
very
blame
good
me for this one.
definition? Sorry?
Nothing. I said, don't blame me for your question, Alex. Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I'm not blaming you. I'm saying
Okay.
it's the way how I'm trying to cope with your
Okay.
with your speculation. No. The question is, isn't this definition very good definition of the absolute? I mean, isn't the absolute precisely what cannot be repeated or reduced, and that is radically and fully the specific individual thing that it is, and also, I mean, since it's a little bit my obsession, I wanted to ask you whether in your account of all these, individual and singular don't really have to be separated, so to say. It's not really relevant to distinguish between individual and singular. I have other questions, but for now I will just ask this one, and then maybe we can go back to the others if there's time. But again, thank you. This was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you so much, Alex, for your question and also for your hint towards this essay. I didn't remember, and I'm definitely gonna go back to it because I'm always looking for more terms to spell out this internal ambiguity that Hegel has towards traditional metaphysics, and this sounds very clear. So thank you very much. So concerning your question, I got scared there for a little bit, and then towards the end, I was like, okay, no, it's not dangerous, because I was very scared of giving such a straightforward definition of singularity right at the beginning of the talk. Also knowing a little bit the work you've been doing in the series and being very familiar with Greg's definition of singularity in his book, in his Hegel book. But then I thought, let's go ahead. Maybe it's going to spark a discussion. So here we are. And I have to say, I'm very happy that you didn't take it in the direction I was afraid it was going to sound, that for me, singularity is not the absolute and just like anything else. I would agree that it's a good definition of the absolute, and I completely agree that for me there is no difference between singular or individual, and I would add absolute. So I think for me the absolute, if we take it to be like also what I was trying to show with essence as reflection, is something that is singular, like it cannot be repeated. There are no two absolute, but also it cannot be repeated what it is doing at any specific moment. So the only thing I would add is to stress like this sort of temporal or dilated and multiple dimension of the absolute. So its singularity is given by the fact that also it itself in any specific moment of its instance cannot be repeated. But otherwise, I fully agree.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have something to.
Okay, please. Yeah, go ahead. Ask a question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Elena. It was a wonderful talk. Although I must say that I was a bit surprised because from the title and the topic, I was guessing that it would be going to be something on the concept, doctrine of concept, and as singularity as it features there. So one of my questions is springing directly from that surprise. Why did you specifically choose to focus on essence and reflection? And dealing, and while the name of the talk was the substance, truth of substance, which I suppose it's the concept, and the last part of is the singularity. So I get some inkling as to why you're focusing on this, because in the essence we get this, the oppositional character of things is dealt with in the doctrine of essence, but insofar as singularity per se is concerned, that is specifically treated in the doctrine of concepts. So why did you choose to deal with essence and reflection? Yeah, this.
Thank you very much. So there are two answers. One is philosophical and one is biographical. So the biographical one is just that when I started my PhD, I started reading the logic and I went in order, of course. And then I just got very fascinated by this very complicated part in the middle. And I was like, I'm just gonna stick there. Of course, I continued to the concept, but then I went back and I was like, I just want to figure out what's going on here because, yeah, it just captured me. So this is the biographical reason. The philosophical reason, which is maybe just my way of justifying my obsession, is that when we get to the concept, you're right, singularity is treated there. The quote I use is from the concept. What I don't like about the concept, or what I don't like about working out these topics with the concept, is that in the concept we have the standpoint is sort of flipped, and it is from it moves from the awareness that's been demonstrated that there is a unity. So the multiplicity, the whole process, the split between essence and being, even as like the principle and the multiplicity, is known to be a unitary process. And so while I fully agree that that's like correct and that's the core of singularity, as you I think also were hinting at, the language that I find there it gets very confusing if I want to emphasize this element of like split and contingency that is, I think, an essential part of the manifestation of the absolute. But one then could always argue, yes, but then in the objectivity we do find it. I know it's I wouldn't say a weakness, but a peculiar singularity of my exposition of the topic.
Can I follow up or should I
Yes,
come back
please,
later?
please, just, yeah, please follow up.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Oh, yeah, I mean, of course. So, I mean, it's okay. So in the doctrine of concept, when we get to singularity, the problem that you're mentioning of this split and multiplicity and, you know, variedness of things. But I think that's precisely what is established when we get to singularity, right? So your worry seems to be, I mean, dealt with there by Hegel. So, yeah, so that's just an immediate thought that I'm having. So, yeah, I mean, how would you respond to that? Because that's precisely what singularity or what the concept turns out to be when it reaches the stage of singularity. So it's not that multiplicity and variedness of things is negated there, but on the contrary, it is in fact established on a firmer basis, as you also, I think, indicate, because the singularity is nothing like it is grounded in something which is more fundamental to that, which is universality. So isn't that don't you think that worry is not it's not so it's not it is not that big of a worry?
Thank you. This comforts me and makes me want to go back to the concept, maybe for a second book. My worry, but it's gonna be a repetition of what I sort of already said with different words. My worry is precisely that then the singularity gets shifted on the side of universality. So the universal is what is singular. And as I was saying, of course, it's the absolute, but I think we lose this dimension of like multiplicity. I know it's there and it's addressed, but one way of putting it is also with this. I had the chance to return to this point while writing a comment to Gregory's book, actually, is how presupposition and position get flipped when we get to the concept. So the concept stresses the positing side of the mediation. So the multiplicity is we see it as always mediated by universality. And I kind of don't want to have this unity on top of my head, so to say. Although I know that it's there, but I think with essence I can stress the fact that it's there, but it's not something substantial in itself beyond the fact that it keeps manifesting itself, if that makes sense. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great. I'm glad there was also follow-up and a little discussion. Other questions from the Zoom before I jump in? As moderator, I will cede the floor for a while.
Greg, maybe I have a
Yeah,
follow-up on this.
yeah, Alex. Yeah, please.
On this topic. So maybe just because what I find interesting about the response you just gave and the general choice of dealing with the doctrine of the essence instead of the doctrine of the concept, if I understand, is that there are those readings who say once you get to the concept, everything before it is false, so to say. So it's that reading that, so to say, understands the objective logic as the critical part and the subjective logic as the new speculative positive metaphysics. And if I understand your point, and I think I agree, maybe you can see, so to say, the doctrine of the essence and the doctrine of the concept as two different ways of dealing with the same problem, which maybe on one side is the critical part, and on the other side is, so to say, the constructive part, so to say. So maybe if I understand your response to Suresh, you're saying I prefer to stress, so to say, the multiplicity, the division, the tension, and you find that in the doctrine of the essence more than in the doctrine of the concept, when instead the accent is on unity, so to say, is on the whole, is on unity, is on so to say, the overcoming of this separation. And so on one level, I mean, you already sold the book. I mean, I will read it. I look forward to reading it. And I was wondering whether this is correct. So whether it is correct to assume that you are basically interpreting the so to say, the critical element in the doctrine of the essence, not just in the in saying, okay, traditional metaphysics and traditional metaphysics of essence was wrong, and I will tell you why, but also in a different way, that is, this critique is essential, and this critique is precisely what we must keep, so to say. So the doctrine of essence keep its relevance by showing us how to criticize that kind of categories, and this is, so to say, this is pivotal. This is not something you simply get past in order to get to the concept. Am I misled in that way of understanding your work?
No, absolutely. It's basically the project that I'm trying to carry out in the book. I would say, in the parts on the doctrine of essence, the way I present it is always in terms of an immanent critique. So Hegel just wants to figure out how to correctly understand these, and he thought like that was not done sufficiently, but it's working within the same concept. It's not like, okay, there is no absolute. Let's move on and let's get to the concept. More precisely to what you were saying with reference to the relationship between objective and subjective logic. Also there you read my idea correctly. So I'm very strongly against these readings that think like objective logic is just like a reduction of whatever was done before, and then like the subjective logic starts from zero, like a shot in the dark, which Hegel, of course, never liked to do. So I think the way I see it's even stronger. I think everything is already there in the objective logic. And then Hegel says, okay, now we figure out it's a unity. So let's just reconsider all we have done so far, how it would sound, how it would look if we add this layer of like, oh, it was actually a unitary process, but like the structure is already there. It's the unity of essence and being, which Hegel, by the way, defines as the genetic exposition of the concept. So how the concept structures or manifests itself as the concept. And then he has to, that's part of his own method once he gets to the conclusion, to sort of run the argument the other way around from the conclusion to the premises. But that's how he demonstrates things. But I don't think there's anything that's maybe extreme, but I don't think there's anything substantive so much that's been added in the doctrine of the concept in terms of like the structure of being or reality that's being laid out in the objective logic.
Very interesting.
May I follow up,
Yeah,
Greg?
please.
Then I'll shut my mouth and leave you to your question.
Keep going.
Just
Okay.
no, because I really like the oh, thank you. Yeah, sorry, my internet is slowing down for some reason, so maybe there's some lagging, and that's why I talk over your voice. But no, I really like this reading, and maybe it will be possible to go even further. So because I mean, everything is already there in objective logic. I agree with this. And also, I mean, this is also part maybe of what Roberto Morani calls the self-reformation of Hegel's dialectics. So the idea that, you know, in the second um, version of the logic of being, you have the concept as being, the concept as essence, and then the concept as concept, which is you are always in the concept, which means that maybe a radical gesture that could be made will be not only to read the logic of being and of essence under the light of the logic of the concept, but also the other way around, namely read the logic of the concept under the light of the logic of being and the logic of essence. So to not have this sort of, vertical stair-like idea of the science of logic, but on the contrary, to consider these the three parts, well, circularly, which is something in a way very, 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 very Hegelian. And also, this is just a comment. You started by saying it is very un-Hegelian how you divided your book, but I'm sure you are very much acquainted with Sasha Hernitz, and I mean, he will strongly disagree. So maybe that's also a way of. I mean, that's very Hegelian too. I mean, maybe the fourth element is precisely this thing. I mean, coming back to the circularly to what has been, so to say, didactically and editorially put before, so to say. I don't know. That was my immediate reaction.
Thank you. The Florence School very present in your response. Yes, I have liked this both with Roberto Morani, who's by the way the of my dissertation, and with Sarah, who's also a very good friend. Yes, the Hegelian thing, I'm just very, and why maybe I don't like to go at the concept very much. I have a weird thing with the number 3. I'm just a bit allergic, so it has to be either 2 or 4. I don't know. But yes, no, I completely agree. And I think it would be very interesting also to try and see like mapping the passages of the objective logic into then the passages of the subjective logic. So a very general hint would be, okay, we start again with a perspective that's very heavily essence-like because everything is mediated. Then we have objectivity and we are back again something a little bit more like being. But yeah, that's just tentative. But I think it would be very interesting to try and see if the two could be mapped. I think Franco Chierghin did something in this direction in his earlier works. Yeah.
It was a really interesting conversation, trying to think through this possibility of the not just concept as being and concept as essence and concept as concept, but maybe essence as being, essence as essence, essence as concept. That's I'll probably get less sleep tonight after that proposal. So also it connects with, I think, Elena's approach. So yeah, that's very fascinating. maybe I can ask a question or two, or maybe I can. Let me see if there's anybody in the. I don't think there's anybody posting in. Yeah, no one posting on YouTube. So let me go ahead and ask a question. Yeah, thanks so much, Elena. So I really enjoyed the paper, and I agree with a lot of the ideas, and I'm thankful for a lot of the points you made, especially about special metaphysics. I thought that's very important and timely, or untimely in certain ways, maybe. But I think that's very important, is the importance of special metaphysics for Hegel. And then and the reformation of it, of course, as well, in the way that it's reformed. And also the one of the yeah, and thinking about the Holy of Holies. Yeah, so the need for a Holy of Holies. Yeah, it's just important that we're public and visible about this. So thank you for being very visible and public about this need for the Holy of Holies. I wanted to ask, yeah, and I wanted to come back to the focus on essence. Not to critique it, but I think I see part of the point after especially hearing your talk and hearing the conversation. I also want to just maybe make a comment and then ask a question related to it. I think what's pretty fascinating is the way that we could think of, so one of the problems with traditional metaphysics is we have these independent thought determinations, which are not connected to each other. And what we have, of course, in the logic of essence is, of course, a unifying of these various determinations through essence and positing and the like. But one of the interesting things that happens in the course of the logic of essence is the doctrine of essence, is that this like opposition of determiner and determined collapses. You have this as you put it, paradox. You have determinations, the positings that are its own versus the positings that are independent of the essence, and that this eventually, by the time you get to concept, this opposition overcomes itself. And I guess one way of reading this is that you could see the whole logic of essence as demonstrating not only limits of traditional metaphysics, but also showing what is necessary in order to have a true metaphysics, namely that these two have to be brought together. Namely that what you need is the overcoming of their separateness or independence. And then the logic of essence would be essential for working out not only what is incomplete about traditional metaphysics, but then about the way in which the concept and the method has to operate in order to have a successful metaphysics and reestablish the holies of holies. Like, so one of my questions, I guess this leads to a question for me, which is that, yeah, so now if the focus on the logic of essence would make sense to me, but then also the transition to subjectivity from substance would be especially important, it seems, because it would be showing that actually in order to reestablish the holies of holies, what you need is a metaphysics of subjectivity. And the logic of essence isn't just critical. It's not, right, as you just pointed out, it's not just now we're going to get rid of it all, but actually the immanent critique is scientific, you could say, right? It's wissenschaftlich, right? It's not, it's part of the science. That is to say, the overcoming also of traditional metaphysics is itself scientific. So yeah, I guess, is there a question in there somewhere? My question first is whether you would agree with anything that I just said about the relation of logic of essence and traditional metaphysics and its relation to subjectivity. But I guess I'm particularly interested in the way some of your terms are used. One is the way that you're talking about you talked about the paradox of right, between the positings that are the essence's own determination, but they're also independent of it. I'm curious, why do you talk about it as paradox and not just as like, well, another scientific contradiction? Just maybe it's not a substantial question, but it also speaks to the way in which like this content is not just a problem, but is truly scientific. And then the other question is about concrete, the way that concrete is used. Because sometimes I got the sense that it means like self-realizing or like self-determining, and sometimes it has like the connotation of finitude, right, versus the abstract infinite. And maybe it has both, at least in the presentation. Yeah, so this is a couple terminological questions. Maybe deflationary here. Maybe because I'm kind of tired. But yeah, so I have some more, but I'll start with this, and then I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Greg. So overall, I agree and followed all that you have said. The one with the Holy of Holies is probably my favorite quote. Absolutely, it's yeah, it pierced my heart when I first read it, and it just stayed with me forever. So I can never not use it in any paper. So I'm gonna jump. I'm gonna try to answer and address everything. I'm gonna jump first to the subjectivity thing, though. So this is actually I had a part on subjectivity in the paper. Then I just decided to take it away because it would have been just too much. I entirely agree on the focus of subjectivity and more to the connection with the Holy of Holies, how to make a metaphysics of modernity. The principle of the exoteric Kantian doctrine, yes, has this element of exalting finitude and the earthly that I really pushed in this paper, but of course, the real principle is subjectivity. And the problem for Hegel is how this emergence of subjectivity, first as like a finite subject that gives itself its own rule, etc., can be taken as a principle, but in such a way that it sort of flips and doesn't stay in a finite subject sort of self-folding on itself, but it then reveals concreteness and openness to otherness. So yeah, for me, subjectivity is central, although it stayed a little bit in the shadows of the paper and has precisely this function that you were also perhaps hinting at, reconstructing what I said about essence, of realizing or a structure that is itself only in the other. So as long as it is taken in this very Hegelian way that entails like recognition with otherness, and realization in otherness, then definitely it's central. Then yeah, in the book I have a bit on how Hegel gets there from modern subjectivity, discussing the second position of thought with Kant. But yeah, that's another story. And yeah, so of course, all of this work in terms of like a metaphysics or a new science is done at the, I need to say it, like I have to admit it, is done in the concept. Like that's, so he has prepared sort of the groundwork. And I would say metaphysically, it's all already there, as I was saying, but it's true that then like the actual exposition from the, how can I say, the metaphysical requirement of a new science is definitely done in the concept. I guess I'm just yeah, I'm not gonna return on why I got stuck on the doctrine.
No, because it makes good sense why you focus on essence. So I appreciate and I think I understand it, but
Right.
so please, yeah, it's good.
And concerning the terms, thank you very much. It's always important to be careful with these things. It's just you write these things over and over, and it's important to get an outside check. Yeah, concreteness here is used sometimes as a technical term, but most of the times as more like a yeah, everyday idea of like finite. Although I would add like, for me, the two things that are not that different, but I like to stress one side, and we've gone over that already. Maybe it's also a taste for provocation a little bit, or dramatic flair. I don't know. With the paradox, of course, it's a scientific contradiction. I would say that, like, from the point of view of essence, it isn't yet.
Right. Good. Right.
It's a bit of a problem,
Yeah.
and it's going to be throughout the whole book until we get to the concept. On the other hand, I also wanted to stress like this element of disorientation, which I think
Yeah.
is important in Hegel as sort of like a transitioning point. And it's also a moment where the tension is preserved. I guess I just don't like the pacified horizon, but that's not pacified, but like seeing things on the side of like, okay, that's the fine complete exposition. I just like to have some I was about to say streben, but I'm not gonna, some tension in there. So I think, yeah, that's why also I like to have paradox because, but you're right, it's a
Yeah.
scientific.
That's really nice because I circled and wrote down speculative disorientation. I really like this term, and I think I will use it in the future. Um, yeah, and it's nice to talk about the perspective from essence rather than the perspective from absolute idea, and then to think about the terminology and how the terminology may shift when you thinking of it from side of essence or from a side of absolute idea. Yeah, and I saw that there is a provocation in the talk. There's a provocation, I think, from the beginning, which I appreciate. I really like provocation. A good talk, I think, should provoke. It's not a sufficient condition, but the idea of the singular, as you mentioned, as the non-repeatable, you connect it to radical finitude and contingency, or the idea of the concrete as finite. Those are all also for me provocations because I think I like to emphasize the other side of it. But I don't want to neglect finitude because I realize how this would be one-sided, right? Neglecting contingency. This is one-sided. So obviously, from a Hegelian point of view, one has to emphasize both sides. But this is not only a question of emphasis, but a question of content as well, right? So yeah, I see the provocation from beginning to end. And I guess the question is just, yeah, what is the place of finitude, right? What is the place of finitude here, right? And how is it integrated in this new metaphysics, right? What's the place of metaphysics now in this holy of holies? And how are we supposed to understand its place? Yeah, so I think this talk really contributed to that question. Yeah, so it's a provocation I'll think about. I'll keep thinking about. Yeah, more
Yeah.
of
Can I just say something?
please. Yeah, yes. I like the problem.
I'm not going to answer the question of finitude and metaphysics, otherwise this would
Yeah,
be
there's
too.
no need. Yeah, it's more me just commenting. Yeah.
But it's a very good question because also there is a little bit of a paradox of reinstating something, but then also completely killing it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the Hegelian way. But on the two sides, of course, I think it's a problem of exposition here. Like that's a very Hegelian question, but I think it's the truth because
Yeah.
in a way you have to pick one side, but then you have to keep doing both. Like you can never stay, which is again what I also like in this reflection idea that it emphasizes. Like you just cannot say, okay, I'm done. You just have to keep.
Yes.
You sort of have to keep running the program in your head, otherwise you lose the concreteness of the truth you're thinking about.
Exactly. Good. Maybe I will cede the floor really quickly to Alex because he said he has another question. So Alex, we have some time still.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very I mean, I don't know whether it's a brief question, but I was very interested in your focus on the relationship between um, Metaphysica Generalis and Metaphysica Specialis. So I was very intrigued by the solution you provided, and I just wanted to uh, I mean, what I find, I'm not sure I understood it because I think it will be better to see it in writing. So I wait to read your work. But um, the way I've always understood it, I mean, in a way, you said at a certain point, this distinction between metaphysics, between general and special metaphysics is overcome, so to say, that they come together, so to say. You cannot simply separate general ontology and special metaphysics, which on some level, I don't know whether you agree, was already done by Kant. I mean, the fact that you have three critiques. In a very general way, one could say, okay, the critiques are the general metaphysics, and so to say, the metaphysics, what Kant calls metaphysics, is the I don't know, the metaphysics of costumes and the metaphysical principles of the philosophy of nature, etc., etc. But you have three critics, so to say. So you don't have just general ontology. You already need some specification in the transcendental part of it. And I've always understood this also on the Hegelian side, in this way. I mean, on the one side, yes, you have to conflate these two elements together, but then you do have a distinction. You still keep the distinction between logic and real philosophy. And on which is problematic, because it looks like, and this is something which is always very much debated. I mean, you have so to say, problems that are discussed twice. So you have the logical way of discussing life, and then you have the philosophy of life in the philosophy of nature. You have you have, so to say, this conflation and separation, um, paradoxically, is apparent in the way how the system is structured. And I think this is also very clear in the logic of concept, because there you have it very clearly. I mean, you have the part on objectivity, which is basically, I don't know how to call it, a pre-philosophy of nature, and apart from the idea that is a pre-philosophy of spirit on some level. But then on the other side, something very important appears that I don't know whether you agree on this. So the first question is, I've always understood, so to say, the relationship between general and special metaphysics as kept and criticized at the same time through this distinction between logic and real philosophy. And I wanted to ask you what role that plays in your way of reading that, in your reading, so to say. And then there's the second problem, which is, I don't know, it's an obsession of mine, so maybe I'm putting it into your talk. But at a certain point, you talked about how these representations, so God, the soul, and the word, are insufficient. So you cannot just give them for granted. And of course, I mean, the problem is not solved if you use three different names. If you use, the absolute, nature, and spirit, it's not. I mean, you have solved nothing if you just find new names for these problems, which maybe brings us to another problem, which is, Hegel's way of addressing these problems is not taxonomical. So the idea is we must abandon the idea that there is a set of things that are nature, or that are spirits, or there is God, etc., etc. And maybe, that's also a consequence, and maybe a reason for this conflation between general and special metaphysics, which means we must abandon the idea that we are, so to say, identifying objects, that we are identifying and so to say, distinguishing sets of things. But again, this is maybe my obsessive way of understanding what you said. But I wanted to ask you whether it makes sense on the basis of what you told us today.
Thank you. It does make sense. You touched on a couple of tricky points that are still. The one with the God of the world, so we have three objects, and then I have to sort of defend that there is only one, because we get logic. That was a huge crisis some years ago, where I was like, no, this doesn't work. I got very confused, but I found a way to make it work, I think. But it's tentative, because then when we get to real philosophy, as you mentioned, it might crumble again. So I'm gonna start there and then go back to the general special metaphysics, how I consider their relation. So I think fact that Hegel says like these are metaphors, God, soul, and the world, these are metaphors, these are representations, is hinting at the fact that he just that's, or I'm gonna put it like this, that's how I justify that from 3 we go to 1. Because the one object, the object of reason or the absolute that's being discussed in the logic or expounded in the logic is the essential structure, like taking in a scientific or conceptual way, like how does a unity realized in a multiplicity works? That's the answer, and it needs to be 1 from the point of view of the concept. So the fact that then it's declined in these 3 figures, it's I don't think it's wrong for Hegel. Nothing is wrong for Hegel. It's just like one way of dealing with it. It's just that it's insufficient if you want to treat it philosophically. It could be a bit of a problem, like this I just said with real philosophy, because then there you have, as you mentioned, you have different like areas of reality that are being considered, and then you're back with the question also of like what's being done here. Is this like a taxonomy of like making a list of I don't think that's what I think Hegel is very allergic to this way of thinking of metaphysics, and it's clear from paragraph 33. He just doesn't care about this sort of taxonomic idea of like, okay, we have one term and that's the one thing that corresponds. Like it just doesn't, he's not interested in that. But I think the relationship within the two, like logic and real philosophy, is more, and I'm going to give a very traditional answer. It's in terms of like a method, or like a, we have the metaphysics is the logic that tells us like how reality works. It's articulated in a series of contingent, irrepeatable contingencies that keep happening, so to say. We have the structure of these in the logic, or of how this happens, and then in the real philosophy is the other side of the work of the philosopher, which is like in my own specific contingent time, what's going on, how is the absolute unfolding, at what levels. The philosophy of spirit has a little more than this, of course, because then there's also the question of like, how does thought or speculative thought appears in reality? That's a whole other thing that I'm not going to open for today. I do get into this question in the book, but not with the philosophy of spirit, because that would have been too much, but with like discussing objective thought and different forms of thinking and how they relate to the structure that's presented in the logic. But I'm not going to go into that today. Just wanted to say that I'm aware that philosophy of spirit also entails that little extra thing. So this is for logic and real philosophy and the 3 objects of reason in Metaphysica Generalis. The relation between the two, it's true that I see them. I think for Hegel in the end, they come to coincide. Like in this paper, I said they are subordinated. Like first we need to understand like, so Metaphysica, the special metaphysics is telling us why there are things and how there are things, so to say. And then the general here in what I've presented is still a little bit like what things are there. Although I don't think that's much of an interesting question for Hegel, but but I think in the logic, and this is not my reading, Lugarini makes this point, although he doesn't go into special metaphysics too much, but he relates the way Hegel connects ontology in the introduction, his logic to ontology. So in the introduction to the logic, he says, like, roughly put, this coincides with what used to be called ontology, but then he gives a very Aristotelian definition of ontology and not like a scholastic metaphysics definition of ontology, which is what he's working with in the encyclopedia. And he calls it like the science of being qua being. So in that respect, given that for Hegel, the sort of metaphorical element of special metaphysics needs to go away, which was connected to the distinction of like infinite and infinite, like keeping them separate, given that this goes away and we are just adding the structure of one thing that articulates in a multiplicity, and at the end of the day, that's what for Hegel also throughout the logic being comes to be, because being is not yet determined being. at that point, ontology and special metaphysics are the same. But if we take ontology in that specific respect, I will not go in the relation to Kant because I'm just too ignorant, so I will not expose myself more than I have already done. But I will think about it because it's very interesting. Thank you.
So yeah, maybe can I come?
Yes.
Oh, thank
Yeah.
you, Elena.
Yeah, so it is just going back to the discussion that we having earlier, and it's addressed to all. I think it's because we were all involved in that discussion of the relationship between different parts of the logic and especially of essence and concept. So first of all, I would say that it has intrigued me. Like obviously we know that Hegel says that retrospectively we can say that being and being and essence were nothing but concepts of being and essence, and so they can be retrospectively seen as concepts. And he also says that the determinations of both being and essence come in their full glory, return in their full glory in the doctrine of the concept. So that's there. So, but we some of were you talking about like seeing it in terms of essence of the concept or the being of the concept in those terms. But while it is intriguing and it is forcing me to think about it, but an immediate thought that I'm having is that it seems to me to be jeopardizing the presuppositionlessness of the logic, because we can have, of course, the concept of being an essence retrospectively, but can we have the being an essence of the concept? Because to think in that way about being an essence would presuppose the concept, which there is no justification to do. So that would just demolish a very, very fundamental, if not the fundamental, a very important claim and structure of the logic. So uh, that's what worries me about thinking it that way. And coming from that, secondly, I think Elena, you mentioned at one time that all is there in the essence. In the concept, we have just like we just put it together. All we had, we just put it. So but it seems to, do we really have it all there in the essence? I mean, just to mention just two things: subjectivity and freedom, which Hegel identifies with the concept. We do not have it in the essence, strictly speaking. It's only at the when this oppositional relational structure of essence collapses with reciprocity that we have self-determination, subjectivity, freedom, and all of those things. So we do not really have it all in the essence. I mean, of course, so I do not. I understand. I do not want to ignore the essence. Of course, it's crucial. It's the mediating. It. Without it, we cannot have the concept. So it might be some personal, biographical inclination bias towards it, because I am mostly working on the doctrine of the concept. So, but quite apart from that, philosophically speaking as well, yeah. So do we have it all there in the essence? So just two things, and it is, I mean, second part is specifically addressed to Elena, but the first part is, anybody can,
Thank you so much. Wow. Okay. You are giving me a hard time, so I will try to defend essence. But just for the sake of continuing this conversation, that's, by the way, really wonderful. Thank you very, very much. But no, first I will go to the presupposition list because it's a smaller, at least what I have to say is a smaller remark. In itself, it's a very big topic. So I think maybe it could be useful to distinguish like presuppositionlessness as a methodological directive of how we have to go about writing a book on these or thinking about something for the first time, and presuppositionlessness as a sort of, how can we call it, like ontological or metaphysical characteristic of what's being described. So in a way, the absolute doesn't have, or the concept cannot have, a presupposition in the sense of something that it's truly other. And we've seen in reflection, like this otherness is produced by the split itself that the absolute is. But these, I don't think, put it like this, like as this ontological characteristic, I don't see it clashing so much with saying something like being an essence of the concept, because we do know that like these are produced by something that is without presupposition, but they need to be produced as presupposition to establish itself. You know, it's like a self-mediation sort of thing. And so once you have that, then you can take it any side you want, and then you still have the thing if you keep in mind that it's a more complex process within which the thing you isolate or the side you take is put. It is an issue for the methodological presuppositionlessness, because of course Hegel doesn't do it, we shouldn't do it. I mean, I think we can do it for the sake of like interpretative clarity or furthering our own understanding of the logic. Like go back, my favorite example is like being nothing becoming, and then we get the term in being. What was happening there, like there is something that's negated, and then like the two of them sort of dynamically relate to each other, and then we have determination. It does sound with what essence is doing, like negating itself. It's just it couldn't be thematized because it couldn't have the two things. So we can go back, you know, retrospectively and presuppose essence or presuppose the concept to better understand what was happening in certain moments, but we shouldn't do it in the analysis of when we are describing the process, which gives me a good, I think, entryway to say what I wanted to say about your question. Do we really have it all there in essence? So one provocative way for me to reply is like we have all that matters to me there. So I am more metaphysical and less modern than Hegel himself. But that's again biographical and secretly anti-Hegelian. In a way, though, there is a Hegelian way to say that yes, we do have everything there. We do everything. We do have everything from the beginning. It's just that it's like sort of stratified and compacted, and then we unpack it, you know, through that. But the whole thing must have been there when we started. Otherwise, we would be bringing stuff from the outside, right? But this is also just like an easy way for me to get away from your question, which was actually on point. Freedom does appear at the end of Doctrine of Essence, because it is with the reciprocity of action that we have the structure of the concept. And there we have the passage from necessity and freedom, but of course the unfolding of this freedom and the understanding of the structure of substance, let's call it like this, that we have observed throughout essence, the understanding that that is actually subjectivity. And I would even add that we can indeed then understand it because our thought, if it's done in the speculative way, does mirror that structure. All of that is in the concept. And it is only demonstrated at the end of the concept, precisely for the methodological thing that I was explaining before, that Hegel gets to the conclusion and then needs to derive the premises from the conclusion to be sure that it made sense.
Fascinating.
Yeah, interesting.
Maybe I
Thank
could
you.
just chime in for a second, ask one final question, and then we'll wrap up if that's okay. Because we're coming to 4 o'clock and we've had a nice hour of discussion. Yeah, so yeah, I liked the questions and the responses because the presuppositionlessness of logic, fascinatingly, like through the self-determination of being, essence, etc., you end up having this self-overcoming of presuppositionlessness. You end up actually logic determines itself to have a ground. It determines itself to be determined by the ground. So the beauty of Hegel's logic is that it turns out that, well, actually all those categories are mediated by a power of self-determination that posits them. So you could, as it were, of course, you have the presuppositionlessness, but you also need the presuppositionless logic to determine itself to be subject to the category of grounded distinction. And that's part of the beauty of logic, of Hegel's logic. Of course, that's not the end of the story, but you know, it has this. I think that's in your exchange. I couldn't help but kind of see this as kind of coming out, shining through, if you would. Yeah, and also in the debate about the unpacking, I think like both are right in a certain way, right? So it's all there, as you said. It's just not explicated. So there is self-determination, there is constant freedom. It's just not explicitly developed as such. On the other, so and that's the analytic side. Then on the other hand, there's the synthetic side, which I feel like is what Suresh was also trying to indicate, right? And so there's something new, there's an amplification, even though at the same time it's an explication of what's there already. So this like synthesis of synthesis and analysis that you get in the absolute idea, I almost felt like in the conversation, you were both in a way moving on one side of the unity, so that together you really were giving us the whole thing. Maybe I just briefly will briefly say something. That was mostly me commenting on your debate, on your conversation, but just a couple of points. And I don't know if this is the anti-Hegelian part of you or if it's just a different Hegelian side, Elena. Which is at the end you referred to essence giving us a principle that grounds singularity, or that there's a principle that grounds singularity. But then on the other hand, we were speaking about singularity as absolute, right? And if we think about singularity as absolute, it almost seems like singularity should be self-grounding or its own principle, right? And then we could maybe think about singularity, because in response to one of my questions, you spoke about finite subjectivity. But I was thinking about infinite subjectivity. I was thinking about, well, absolute subjectivity, self-singularizing subjectivity, right? Where, for example, sometimes so say God maybe is the metaphorical term for concept. And the reason I say this is that, like, of course, I didn't want to talk too much about singularity since we were talking about essence mostly. But just to finish it off here, and since we've been having the conversation, that yeah, singularity is on the one hand like non-repeatable, but it's also, it seems like it's also all of the like universal, particular, singular are all singular, right? So it also seems to be universal, like it's repeatable, but also not repeatable, just like you said. So like at the end of the day, as it were, like we have both the repeatable and the non-repeatable together. And so I'm just wondering, like in your thinking about Hegel and the singular, is there a place for the repeatable in your view of the singular? And I'm just wondering about because you mentioned finite subjectivity, and I'm wondering whether the subjectivity, which turns out to be the singular, is a kind of singular subjectivity. I mean, he does talk about, maybe this is metaphorical again, in the absolute idea, he talks about absolute personality. And he talks about the absolute idea, in fact, as the absolute person, or as person. This came up in Chile at the summer school that I was just, we spent a whole day arguing about what absolute personality is at the end of the logic, whether it's just a metaphor or whether it's like a notion of infinite subjectivity or something. And anyway, there's probably like 12
What was the
questions.
point of my talk in Hong Kong, Greg? Remember?
Oh, yes, exactly.
It was
Yeah.
the topic of my talk in Hong Kong, yeah.
Yeah. So I think you were in the back of my mind, Alex. So yeah, I had to ask about my obsession since Alex was asking about his. So there, I just asked about mine. So yeah, just comment on anything I said. Sorry that there's like 5 questions in there, but thanks so much.
That completes the obsession part of everybody.
The obsession parts are done now. Elena, please.
Thank you, Greg. This is brilliant. So where to start? So I think you caught a few of things I'm still struggling with.
Yeah.
And I have to sort of cut through them. And some days they make sense. Some days they make less sense. It's part of why we do a very great job.
Yeah.
Fun job. So on the anti-Hegelian aspect, like when I say principle grounding singularity, that's using older metaphysical language. Like I think Hegel is turning in his grave every time I write something like that. It's just from Hegel's point of view, it's just like not correct. I would say. On the other hand, what fascinates me of what's happening there is that, which is also like it connects with the relationship between essence and concept, because on the one hand, on one level, essence is already the concept, and it genuinely like transforms into the concept. I'm kind of sure of that, but it's only one side of essence, and Hegel is using the same term essence also to identify just one side of what's happening with the concept. So then essence slowly getting closer to the concept becomes like the unities that split in the two, and so indeed a third with two sides. And that's why it cannot be essence anymore, because essence in the non-speculative, I don't know how to call it, side is defined by the opposition to the other. What gets me stuck before, like the big gate of the subjective logic, is that I do feel that this third is like a bit of a void. It's not nothing, but it shouldn't be something other than this continuous process. Although I do agree, and this conversation, which really has been amazing, I cannot thank you all enough, is making me even, it's made it even clearer. It cannot be just the finite thing. Like it cannot be just the contingent thing, because then otherwise it's the whole split. It is indeed realized in these contingencies, but the whole process needs to be preserved. Yeah, this is just to say that yeah, with your question on this, you sort of pinpoint something I'm still struggling with, like to unpack the different layers. With respect to the repeatability, I think the movement repeats, but like the result keeps changing. That's how I would like put it. Like that's so it's singular in its never repeating itself, but repeating the same thing, just never with the same result. And with the personality, that's like, we also had a seminar in Padua on the absolute idea in June, and we were also, so maybe there was like a convergence of minds through the world, just
Yeah.
obsessed with the same line.
Alex and Padua and me, and then Chile, and the whole world was talking about absolute
What my Nigerian friends call the Hegelian mafia, that's meeting all over the world. And what I like about that quote, but this is just like I've been just saying it like this because I'm also a bit tired, but also I can't say much. What I like about that quote and the idea of personality, which is very dear to me, by the way, like despite this insistence on like the third is nothing and it's a void and it's just negative, it's just very dear to me to think that like there's a subject we are all part of somehow, and it's like not just a subject, but it's actually a person. And what I like about this image, but it's what I put on it, that's not from Hegel, is that he can make mistakes. Like it is fallible, and we live as part of that fallibility. I find it just like it's my holy of holies, because it gives me like a way to go through the world that's joyous. I don't know how to, but that
What
is
is your
getting
holy of holies? Sorry, I missed that.
this idea that like
Ah,
we are part of something that's fallible in its manifesting itself. And we are these fallibilities a little bit. It gives me a reason to go on
good.
making mistakes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elena. This has been really a rich conversation, and thanks all to the participants who, Suresh and Alex, those of you who asked questions, and also, yeah, just thanks for those of you who came and listened, and even if you didn't ask any questions, thanks for being here. Okay,
I
well,
must say that I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion, and I now regret why I did not join earlier sessions.
That's
There were
okay.
reasons I could not join them because I had my class timing clashing with them. Today my day was off, so but I will ensure that I join every other coming up. Yeah,
Good, good.
yeah. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Irina,
Thanks.
Moss,
So
and
much.
else.
It's been amazing for me, really. Thank you very, very, very much.
Thanks, Elena. Okay.
Thank you so much, Elena.
You have any announcements?
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye-bay. All right.
No. We are just going to send an email to all the mailing list with the next talks.
Okay.
So in a couple of days, we are going to let you know what is coming. We are cooking. So